Okay, you can start.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Nathan Jones, and I will be introducing and moderating our panel here on fentanyl and third-generation gangs in Latin America. We have an all-star panel. I feel like I need Chicago Bulls hype music, as we bring out the starting lineup here. We have an all-star lineup here, and I'm going to go through and give a brief introduction before we get into it. So beginning, we have our top ranking academic here. We've got full professor, Dr. Guadalupe Correa Cabrera of George Mason University. She has an amazing book, Cetas Inc., applying corporate models to Mexican organized crime groups. I think it's a groundbreaking book in terms of applying corporate models, and it's available on Amazon right now. And in true organized crime fashion, I have demanded 10% of all proceeds. No, just kidding. So we've got an amazing leading scholar, and then next we've got John P. Sullivan, who is our top practical I call him a practical academic. He has an extensive law enforcement career, so he's actually applied and done real investigations related to organized crime. And he is incredibly well published as a scholar with his PhD from Spain's Open University of Catalonia, where he studied under Manuel Castells. So, I mean, we have an amazing scholar practitioner here. And myself, Dr. Nathan Jones, I'm an associate professor at Sam Houston State University in security studies. I'm also a Small Wars Journal senior fellow, and John P. Sullivan is a driving force on that, and he is the driving force on that. He's a senior fellow there as well, and I'm also a non-resident scholar with Rice University's Baker Institute. And then we've got Dan Weiss Argomito, who is an amazing brand new scholar. He just finished his PhD, so he is Dr. Dan Weiss Argomito. Congratulations to him. And he just finished his PhD at UC Irvine, looking at the Mexican military. And also issues related to gender-related violence and things along those lines. He's from UC Irvine, brand new PhD, and he is currently on the job market right now. So if any scholars out there who are watching right now, if your department is going through a hire, we vouch for him like it's the mafia. He's a great guy. He's a wonderful person. And just tell us where we need to send the bribes. Just kidding. We're just trying to work in as many organized crime jokes here as we can here in this intro to keep it entertaining. But seriously, Dan is amazing. He's an amazing young scholar. He's been writing for us pretty heavily with the Small Wars Journal as well, where he is also affiliated. And Dr. Guadalupe Correa Cabrera is also affiliated. She's also a fellow with the Small Wars Journal El Centro, which is the Latin America division. I'd like to say a brief word because that's how we, on this panel, we all know each other. That's one of our common links here is the Small Wars Journal. The Small Wars Journal was a website that got going in the aftermath of the U.S. invasion in Iraq, and it became very clear to many, for example, former Marines, that there wasn't enough counterinsurgency literature, that this was a blind spot. And so they started the Small Wars Journal website, and it became very influential. It's heavily read inside the military. It's heavily read inside the Pentagon, but it's open access, so it's heavily read by everybody who's interested in security issues related to small wars, insurgency, counterinsurgency. And John P. Sullivan and Robert Bunker made an amazing decision in the late 2000s, early 2010s there to start the Small Wars Journal El Centro division of the website, which was focused on Latin America and organized crime. And it has been a true boon to the literature. The open access nature of it is truly a labor of love. He's put in a tremendous amount of work on it. Since I've been a senior fellow, I've put in a tremendous amount of work on it. And I'd like to put that plug out there. We are now fully peer reviewed on the El Centro side. So if you submit directly to me or John, we will put you through a full peer review. We're looking for articles of about 3,500 words in length, and we'll put you through a fairly rapid but full and comprehensive peer review for your research, as long as it's related to Latin America, organized crime, and major security issues. So now that I've introduced and encouraged submissions, I want to do a quick intro of this topic, and I'm going to give a brief, and at some point I'm actually going to pitch to John very quickly, but let me give you a brief intro here. So we're here discussing fentanyl and third generation gangs in Latin America. And fentanyl is a new phase of the opioid crisis in America, but it is obviously a global problem with global supply chains that we need to flesh out a little bit here. So first, in the United States, we had doctors overprescribing opiates in the 1990s, and this became a burgeoning problem throughout the 2000s. People like Sam Quinones have written amazing books like Dreamland, really documenting the scourge of the opiate crisis here in the United States. And we have transitioned from heroin and plant-based drugs increasingly to synthetic drugs. We saw that transition with methamphetamines and pressure on Sudafed markets here in the United States, forcing, making it more difficult to produce domestically, and that being pushed down into Mexico, where large Mexican organized crime groups were actually able to produce it better and cheaper. Now we're seeing a move with opiates from plant-based opiates cultivated either in Colombia or in Mexico or throughout Latin America, more towards synthetic opiates, specifically fentanyl. That is the big one, but other opiate derivatives such as carfentanil and many others. And these are oftentimes brought in via precursors from India and China. They come into Mexico. The precursors are put together in labs at that point, and then it is trafficked into the United States. It's highly profitable. It's incredibly cheap to make. That is not the only vector, and shortly I'm going to pivot to John, and he's going to describe the other vectors of how this enters the United States. But this has become a bigger issue now, in part because we are now up to 110,000 overdose deaths in the United States. And 70 to 80,000 of those are now attributed specifically to fentanyl. And I was doing some recent research on cocaine, and you look at the cocaine overdose numbers, and they're fairly low and they're very steady. And then you see another number when you look at the CDC data, and it's cocaine mixed and cut with fentanyl at the same time. And you see those numbers doubling in recent years. So we've seen this become a much bigger issue because of the sheer public health crisis that it has led to. That has also led to political responses. And some of these political responses can be described as reactionary. There are Republican congressmen now calling for the use of the military in Mexico to target fentanyl labs. And they're describing various different things. They're talking about going and doing strategic strikes, surgical strikes on labs, but it seems unrealistic given how decentralized many of these labs are in Mexico. It's also a major sovereignty issue for Mexico, and anyone who understands a modicum of U.S.-Mexico history understands that this idea of using U.S. military forces in Mexico is not going to go well on the Mexican side of the border in terms of Mexican politics, the memory of the Pershing raid, the memory of the Mexican-American War, and all of the various sovereignty issues that Mexico has dealt with vis-a-vis the United States. That has led to a very strong backlash against that. And so the question becomes, if there were to be this broader debate about the use of U.S. military in Mexico related to this fentanyl issue, what would we lose in terms of cooperation and bilateral cooperation? And I think that that's going to be a theme that we're going to discuss throughout. At this point, I'd like to do a quick screen share here and put up some slides and pitch it to John to give us a working definition of third generation gang literature. This has been around for going on a little over 30 years now. It has become an ingrained part of the literature. And since we're talking about it, it's good that we start with a working definition on it. So let me just get a quick screen share here. And John, why don't you start us off while I start pulling this up here? I'm having a little difficulty.
Sure. Bottom line up front, I want to point out that third generation gangs are mostly involved in street level micro trafficking or narcomenudeo, and they're not currently the major players in the fentanyl trade, but they may well have a future in that realm. To kind of point things off, I view this entire phenomena through several lenses. One is viewing it as criminal armed groups, so not just organized crime, but I'm interested in criminal armed groups that challenge the sovereignty of the state. I'm interested in hybrid conflict where nation states use organized crime as a strategic lever for influencing other nations. And I look at it as a traditional organized crime network. So we're looking at strategic crime, transnational organized crime, and gangs, transnational gangs. Resource extraction is part of the piece. Criminal insurgencies are not a criminal enterprise taking over the legitimate portion of the state. They're drivers of state transition, as Charles Tilley would talk about it. So that's often misunderstood. There's a range of criminal networks that participate in this realm. Pirates, militias, cartels, mafias, and gangs. And there are some places which you could call feral or narco cities or criminal enclaves. And there's some discussion about a black force. You know, in the military, you talk about the red force, your adversary, the blue force, yourself, and the black force, kind of criminal enterprises. So we're seeing a mix of crime and war. Now, through the third generation model, and this will be a quick off the top. Next slide, please. Back in 1997, I put together a future-looking model based upon the work of Malcolm Klein at the University of Southern California. He was a eminent gang scholar of the time, and he did define there were two generations of gangs: turf gangs that were engaged in turf protection, drawing back to the classic work in Chicago, and then market gangs, which were driven by the Crips and Bloods and their global expansion in the United States. And then I postulated that there was perhaps a third generation that would be a mercenary gang whose goals could be power or financial acquisition. And I first saw that potential in Chicago with the El Rukins, who were a variation of the Blackstone Rangers, were arrested by the FBI for attempting to purchase Laws rockets for Muammar Gaddafi. So initially that was a projection. The three metrics I came up with were politicization, from limited, very neighborhood-based, through global. So, or I could mix them up. Limited politicization, very small local politics, through evolved global. Internationalization, from local, one housing project, one neighborhood, through the nation, through an entire nation, or parts of a nation, through a global network. And then sophistication, being less sophisticated to more sophisticated. Essentially, what we're talking about is illicit networks. And as the research evolves, we start to see prison street gang nexuses, like where the gang operates from prison, but projects its power into the street. And I've largely looked at this phenomena in Mexico and Brazil, but increasingly in places like South Africa, Ecuador, Central America. So that's the basic model. Started out as a projection. Over time, it started to mature. We move to the next slide just quickly, Nate. And then I suggest what we perhaps do is, after this slide, we'll stop, and then I'll come back to talk about the specifics of how I see this manifesting itself now. So what we're talking about are illicit flows. We're talking about adaptive illicit networks, gangs, cartels, mafias, and they're both the flows of, we used to call these organizations drug trafficking organizations. They're really currently poly-crime organizations that are engaged in lots of different criminal enterprises, ranging from extortion through the drug trade, through the arms trade, through human trafficking, sex trafficking, and a range of financial crimes. So we talk about financial flows, operational ties, and some specialized nodes. And I would note that there are some specialized purveyors of services to the other criminal enterprises, and they work very active in the money laundering sector and in parts of the arms trade. For example, there's a specialty cartel in Spain that develops narco subs, or low profile semi-submersible vehicles for transporting narcotics from North Africa into Europe. And they work for a lot of different activities. Now, the circuits that I'm looking at here really talk about function and location. And I would call your attention to Manuel Castell's work on the space of places and flows. Here we're looking at the flows. So when we talk about fentanyl, we talk about fentanyl coming from China, with a smaller niche coming from the Hong Kong Special Autonomous Region. And it flows in the US discourse. We emphasize, I think, perhaps more than we need to, the flow of finished product and precursors to Mexico. Now, some of those products stay in Mexico. There's some street level sales there. And then the finished product flows into the United States. And the United States has identified the major problem there being China to Mexico to the United States. Obviously, precursors flow both ways. The second route, the one that we don't talk about a lot in the United States, but my friends in Mexico City remind me regularly, is the flow of finished product and precursors directly to the United States, and then the street sales in the United States. And that's a big piece. We don't emphasize that in our political dialogue, but the bulk of that comes into California. Obviously, we're on the Pacific Rim. Just an interesting aside from the Mexico piece, 75% of the fentanyl trade from Mexico comes through Baja California, from Tijuana, Tecate, up into San Diego. But it doesn't stay in California. It moves throughout the rest of the United States. And there are other organized crime groups, gangs, motorcycle gangs, Crips and Bloods, and Serenos, and others that move it throughout the United States. The third route is finished product and precursors from China to Canada, primarily to Vancouver. Some stays in Canada, and then another component of finished product moves back into the United States. The last piece, the Chinese, as they get deeper involved in these organizations, and these are Chinese networks of various types. Many of them are specialty organizations that just move precursors. Others are tied to the centuries-old triads and tongs. The Hong Kong police often talk about triad activity into Canada and Vancouver, and there's a well-established route there. But they had a back channel route where they started moving product in and precursors into India. And the emerging flow is, as we crack down on Chinese and trade, that we start to see finished product moving from India into Mexico. So that's the basic circuit arrangement. Before I pass it back to you, I have a bunch of discussion about current events, but I think I should do that last after we get Guadalupe and Dan on, to give them some time. I would just say that China's a wild card. Keep that in mind. There's a lot to look. And I put it back to you, and I'll come back later.
Okay, let me just get out of the slideshow there. Okay, so at this point, I would like to pitch it to Dr. Cabrera, Guadalupe, and we'd like to hear from you for 5 minutes on your thoughts on fentanyl and third generation gangs.
Absolutely, and I am very glad that you organized this. Thank you for the organization of this event, the global initiative, and this excellent panel that you all put together. So thank you, Nate, for this. Thank you, John, for setting up the framework to understand this complex phenomenon. You and Nate may maybe know much better what I'm going to be writing about and what research is about. And I'm talking about a new generation of forms of organized crime, I would say, that will probably go beyond the third generation, what you call gangs, the third generation gangs. The first generation, the turf oriented, as you mentioned, as you well explained. The second generation, driven by drugs and mercenary oriented, and the third generation, small, led by political orientations and increased sophistication and transnationalization. I am alleging that there is a new generation of cartels that has to do with the new framework incorporated by what we know as the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. I know that Nate and I have been talking about that. I have read Nate's work, but I think that we need to incorporate further elements. Yes, you, Nate, and others have talked about illicit networks, not necessarily gangs or cartels or criminal corporations, as I did in the book Los Zetas Incorporated. So I'm trying to explain the new configuration of organized crimes without the utilization of the world cartels or without the utilization of the world gangs. We're talking about sophisticated networks of actors or systems of different, I would say, networks. When we talk about systems, it's even more complex. It's not just transnational, but it's more complex. Complex adaptive systems in the jargon, or the military jargon, I would say, that has to do with counterinsurgency, misinformation, the fourth generation things that focus on what the media is about, but it's not just that. It's just the configuration of these systems that are of complex adaptive mechanisms, adapt to the new circumstances. And when we talk about the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, we're really not talking about an organization that it's just like horizontal, like Los Zetas, that we kind of like, I try to explain to some extent, but we were, we saw some leadership, we saw some, organization horizontally, but now we're not necessarily talking about a corporation or an homogeneous model of business. We're talking about systems that work in different directions and adapt to the new realities. And when a group call themselves Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, we don't have to talk about drugs. We really don't have to talk about drugs. The Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación is present, for example, in the border of Guatemala and Tabasco, for example. And these groups are part of kidnapping rings that are saying, I'm Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. So with that fear, you generate misinformation, special operations, and all this, the military jargon can be explained. That's what I'm talking about, the new generation cartels that has to do with the militarization strategy, and that generates phenomena that can just be explained by military strategy and military operations, which is important, and which is important to erase that vision of the narcos and the vision of the fentanyl driven by the narcos. And that's why the proposal by the main leadership in the Republican Party, not just Donald Trump, I'm talking about the candidates for the presidency, all of them that are just like in agreement with regards to what they need to say about the fentanyl crisis and how to solve it, declaring a war on cartels or declaring the cartels just before the war on cartels, which is like a very, it's idea that's based on an inaccurate conception of the criminal world in Mexico, south of the border. Because for the United States, drug trafficking, drug consumption is a national security issue. And when we are thinking about the security panorama in Mexico, we're seeing a very different thing. Not necessarily all the groups that we're talking about are cartels in the sense of drug cartels for the United States, where they don't even know how to conceptualize what we are going, what the transformation is about, and they are trying to declare a war on what? A war on networks that are formed by families, that are formed by actors that dedicate themselves to illicit and illicit activities. Yes, we need to understand this better. And we have books that have talked about the market of fentanyl and as a way, I mean, as systems. And so that we have to understand that if you declare a war on cartels, you're going to be declaring a war on civilians. You will declare a war on Mexico and Mexican people. And this is very concerning and very complicated. 2024 is going to be about that. It's going to be centering on the border again and the connection of border issues to matters of undocumented migration, the fentanyl crisis, and now with regards to terrorism. We're starting to hear about how the so-called cartels are connected with Hamas, are connected to everything that the United States considers an enemy. So we have to be very rigorous, very concrete. First of all, we're not talking about cartels because the drug trafficking organizations are not cartels. They did not form oligopolies that act like monopolies because they fight for the control of a territory. So we really have to be very rigorous. We really have to reframe our conversation, our concepts. And now it's very difficult not to talk about cartels because everybody uses that term that is completely misused to express a very different reality. So we have to think about that. And now, in my perception, we have a new generation of gangs. We have a new generation of criminal organizations. We have to probably work on a new framework to understand what we are living together now, because of the militarization of crime and because of the military responses to crime too, that generates complex adaptive systems. Thank you very much.
That was fantastic. You raised a lot of excellent issues there. And I am excited to see, actually, I'm going to pivot now to Dan. I'm excited to see what Dan has to say about third generation gangs and the fentanyl crisis.
Thank you. For sure. So I'm going to take it in a little different route. I want to kind of showcase some of these complex networks and also talk about fentanyl in ways that we haven't really discussed. Now, of course, I don't want to take anything away from the opioid crisis or the toll it's taken on human beings. I want to reference the environmental costs only to show what the repercussions of these synthetic drugs are doing in Mexico. So as many of you know, the production of these synthetic drugs, so be it fentanyl, methamphetamines, MDMA, or amphetamines, they require electricity and water sources. And production is incredibly costly to the environment. For every kilo produced of drugs, 5 kilos of chemical waste is produced. And these chemicals include things like solvents, acid, chemical binders. And just for example, in the municipality of Tamazula, in the state of Jalisco, General Javier Jiménez Mendoza and Román Galán Treviño, who's a representative of the Semarnat, that's the Secretary of the Environment and Natural Resources in Mexico, found several drug labs that had contaminated not only the earth, but rivers, streams, and even water tables. And they noted that they detected specifically sodium hydroxide, ammonium hydroxide, chloric acid, sulfuric acid, and ammonium sulfate. Now, I'm not a chemist, so I had to look up what the actual effects of these are on the ground. And what it does is that essentially the second that it touches waterways, it causes the death of fish and other species. And then when it hits the ground, these chemicals also accelerate the erosion of the land by destroying essential nutrients that impede the proper filtration and storage of water. So the production of these synthetic drugs has essentially exploded across Mexico. And it's now also polluting one of the most vital biospheres in the world, which is the Sea of Cortés, or the Mar de Cortés. This area is responsible for 11% of Mexico's GDP, and researchers now report that at least 1,600 tons of chemical pollutants are dumped because of the production of these synthetic drugs in this area. In Sinaloa, the pollution related to this production of synthetic drugs has led to the displacement of animals like the jaguar. And in the San Lorenzo Valley, several rivers and lagoons have completely dried up. And this is because of the pH levels caused by chemical pollution. Some environmental activists even reported that colors of rivers in locations close to these illicit drug labs have changed, and that there has been a dramatic increase in dead fishes in these rivers. So these organizations have involved themselves in illicit fishing in the Mar de Cortés since 2013. And that's because they wanted to supply the Asian market with several endangered species, including the totoaba fish and cannonball jellyfish. And I know you must be thinking, why is this man speaking about fish right now? I promise it'll make sense in a second. So the Mar de Cortés, apart from the GDP, is also incredibly important for fishing. You have to realize that it's responsible for at least half, if not more, of the commercial fishing for all of Mexico. And it's also a vital ecosystem that's home to thousands of species of fish, of which 10% is only found in this sea. Now, several organizations have involved themselves in the illegal traffic of several species, but the totoaba fish in particular is very valuable. You see, a kilo of this fish can reach anywhere between $20,000 to $100,000 in the Chinese black market. And what we've found is that organizations that are now imposing themselves onto the fishermen in this area are exchanging this fish for chemicals used in the production of synthetic drugs, such as fentanyl and methamphetamines. Now, I can go on and on about the repercussions. Obviously, one of the worst, that's most popular, that's being sort of heard around the world is of the vaquita marina. If you don't know what the vaquita marina is, it's the world's smallest porpoise. And because fishermen use special gill nets to capture this totoaba fish, and the vaquita marina is a similar size, they get caught up and die. Because of these illegal extractions, the population of this vaquita marina has decreased from 600 in 1997 to 30 in 2016. And the problem goes beyond just illegal species. The criminal organizations also go directly to fish producers, force them to forge documents so that they say that, for example, shrimp are being caught and extracted in the legal season when they're not. And we also see that there's an overfishing in the entire peninsula because of these organizations. When talking about illegal logging, it is now calculated that 30% of the logging industry in Mexico is being taken over by organized crime. Just in 2020, illegal logging in Mexico managed to be responsible for the loss of around 127,000 hectares of forest. Just so we understand the magnitude of that, that's greater than the total deforestation recorded between 2010 and 2015. So clearly these extractive forces are becoming very detrimental in Mexico. These organizations are becoming more sophisticated and becoming a problem in different sectors. And it requires a lot of precise research to be able to understand these links and understand also the consequences of the production of fentanyl. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dan. Again, you brought up many of the issues that Guadalupe, many of the themes that Guadalupe also touched upon, primarily that this issue of fentanyl and third generation gangs touches upon many other sectors of the economy, and that there's a widespread diversification of these activities. And it touches upon other issue areas. Guadalupe mentioned terrorism, migration, and how these issues were being brought in, rightly or wrongly, onto this. You've brought up environmental and then destruction related to fentanyl production and the synthesis of these chemicals, also the very fact that these are being traded directly, i.e. It's not just a money exchange. In some cases, it's a precursor exchange for these endangered species that are highly valuable. But all of this has organized crime as a common feature. And so this is where I want to pitch it to John. John, what are your thoughts on whether or not fentanyl will continue to be a major issue in the future, or is the common thread here really organized crime and these third generation gangs that you postulated in the 1990s?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. Let me try to hit this. And I'll hit fentanyl directly. The short answer is fentanyl is the current flavor of the day. It's not the only threat. The main threat from all varieties of organized crime is the corrosive corruption and erosion of state legitimacy. It's basically, we talk about the U.S. point of view, and I grew up in Guadalupe, the U.S. militarization or just desire for militarization to address cartels is counterproductive, not going to work, and doesn't really describe the situation. Where I would disagree is third generation gangs, I don't think are irrelevant. They're just one piece of the framework. And there are criminal armed groups that directly challenge the state militarily, and they need to be addressed. You see those certainly in Brazil with the PCC and the Comando Vermelho. Most of the gangs don't reach that level. In the fentanyl trade, they don't. In Latin America, the fentanyl trade is dominated by the CJNG, the Jalisco cartel, and Sinaloa. And the troubling link there is when they link with other enterprises. We're starting to see them link with the Sinaloa cartel, for example, with the PCC in Brazil, and they link into global illicit circuits with the Andrangheta. But when we talk about fentanyl, I think the criminal organizations are more important than the product they sell or traffic in, because they are polycrime organizations that are engaged in lots of things. But you also think there was an article Insight Crime put out a couple of days ago talking about the Latin American fentanyl market. There are two distinct market characteristics in fentanyl. One is legitimate pharmaceuticals that are diverted and trafficked by criminal enterprises, and the other are the illicit fentanyl that's built through that flow that I showed from China into Mexico, Canada, and the United States. The trade in finished product is bigger than the precursor-driven trade. Most of the third-generation gangs, which are transnational gangs, are not major drug trafficking organizations. I think when people talk about MS-13 about being an 18th Street or Barrio 18 as being drug trafficking organizations, they're not trafficking organizations, DTOs in that classic sense. They're street gangs, either in the second or third generation, depending upon how you look at it. I'd say they're third generation transnational with political components, especially in places like El Salvador. I think we need to be concerned about other synthetics. Fentanyl, carfentanil, they're not the first. Most of your third generation gangs are very limited into the fentanyl trade. They're bigger into methamphetamine, MDMA, and other synthetics. I think those will grow. I think the big ticket in Latin America now is the trade of cocaine and enabling the flow of cocaine through through West Africa up into Europe with the assistance of groups like the Andrangheta. Other criminal businesses are as important. I think some of their other businesses make more money than drugs. Talk about migrant smuggling, talk about human trafficking in the sex crime type of business, talk about resource extraction. I mean, Dan hits the fauna piece. They're also engaged in illicit flora trade. The Amazon is like probably the hotbed of the next catalytic conversion of organized crime groups. 18th Street, we talked about them being mostly engaged in meth. MA, the Mexican mafia, I'd say the same thing. We are starting to see some criminal groups, particularly in Brazil, moving from just street level micro trafficking into broader trafficking. And just recently, I just got back from Brazil about a week and a half ago, spent some time lecturing to the military prosecutor there. We start to see both the PCC, the Primeiro Comando do Capital, and the Commando Vermelho, the Red Command, starting to move into the fentanyl trade. They're starting very small with that pharma piece, with the diverted legitimate pharma, but the earlier indications in a couple of the favelas, for example, Complexo del Mare in Rio de Janeiro, we see the third the Tercero Commando Puro, or the third pure third command, actually just series of arrests within the last 2 weeks, and not just the gangs, but the militias. And I think, interestingly, in Brazil, and this is a change I've seen over the years, the Brazilian law enforcement and judicial community is starting to see the militias, which originally started as police vigilantes, starting to see them just as another variety of organized crime. That's a sea change in how they've looked at things there. Up in the northern part of Brazil, the Family do Norte is also starting to be seen in the fentanyl trade, mostly micro trafficking, but starting to move larger. And there's a group down in Santa Catarina, south of Rio and south of Sao Paulo, a group called the Primero Grupo Catarinense, and they're a rival of the PCC, but they're engaged in the fentanyl trade. So it's mostly pharma fentanyl. There's not a significant local market in Brazil, but that's starting to grow. These groups I talked about in Brazil, they are transnational criminal enterprises. They operate in Paraguay. They operate in Venezuela. Chile is an area where we start to see some of the third generation gang typology strengthening. There's a group called the Tren de Aragua. It's what they call in Venezuela a mega banda. They operate from Venezuela all the way down to the southern cone, both sides, Argentina, but especially in Chile. Right now, they're mostly doing street level drug sales in Ecuador and Venezuela, but they're starting to link, and this is another one, I mentioned China being a wild card, starting to link with other Chinese gangs, mostly from Fujian, so the Fujianese gangsters, if you call them. So the Chinese organized crime has specialists that specialize in specialty entities. They have the long-standing triads, which, I mean, when we talk about Mexico and Chinese organized crime, I think of Ensenada and Chinese gangsters being there in the 19th century. They're not all dominant in the trade now, but those links are not necessarily new. China is moving its organized crime and other business interests heavy duty into Latin America. And so I'd say that's really a wild card. There's one group from Fujian called the Bang Clan. So what we see is this, and this is where I think Guadalupe and I come off on the same point. These are complex adaptive networks with many components, and we simplify them in the United States and elsewhere by calling them just cartels. Well, they call themselves cartels, that's fine, but they're really networks. And the network is a combination, because we think we're going to put them all in prison and stop the gangs like they're working on in El Salvador. Well, you know what? Prisons is where most radicalization occurs. The Camorra, the local mafia from Naples, where part of my family comes from, was founded in prison. The Barrio Azteca in the Texas part of the world was founded in prison. MA, which controls all the street gangs in Southern California to one degree or another, starts in prison. The PCC and the Commando Vermelho in Brazil start in prison and project force. So it's highly complicated. We oversimplify these. I often think of the third generation gang as the jumping off point from gang to a more sophisticated mafia. And I think Guadalupe and I agree with that. The question is, what does that look like? And we can't read the future, but we can see that this complexity is going to drive our understanding of organized crime, national security, and hybrid threats well into the future. And I think I covered most of my talking points.
Oh, yeah. Oh, fantastic. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Are you,
Done.
You have more to go, or were you about to stop?
No,
Okay.
I don't know how much time we have left, but
Well, I think we've got about 5 minutes for discussion amongst ourselves before we want to open it up to anybody who's got questions out in the audience.
Well, then let me bounce this to Guadalupe, because we agree in large measure. And I think there's really no disagreement on policy. But what's the nuance? What are the drivers from your perspective that we need to look at that causes the further evolution? Because in my mind, the groups that traveled from first through second through third generation always were influenced by their connection and alliances with other enterprises. And we often look at mafias as if they're unitary. When we talk about the 5 families in New York, well, the 5 families are composed of dozens, of smaller cells, gangs, crews, cliques, whatever you want to call them. They call them different things at different places, but they're composite, they're networked organizations, and they often rely on corrupt state officials to enable their activities. So what do you think? And I know you're working on a new book on this, but what do you think is our prime driver we need to look at?
We need to stop focusing about drugs only, because that kind of like obscures our understanding of the local dynamics of these groups. And this is why, for example, a number of journalists have asked me why, if Andrés Manuel López Obrador has changed his approach to fighting organized crime, but he continues militarizing. We have to understand also that this is a cycle that is a nonstop cycle of militarization. I think that with regards to these, we don't involve necessarily how state forces operate here. With this, it's a not ending fight between or plight between state forces and what you call gangs. And there are different phenomena that we don't separate very well. Not everything that we're talking about is transnational in nature. And this is important. I mean, for example, the Barrio 18 and the Mara Salvatrucha, the MS-13, in the Northern Triangle, they extort people in the Northern Triangle. And there is a transnational component, but we have to, separate it from the local and the national phenomenon that's basically local. And that's something that the model does not explain, or the third generation gang does not explain, because the militarization per se has—
Guadalupe, I have to disagree. It does, but it's not in one writing, it's in multiple writings over 30 years.
That's right.
The local component is actually present in the first and second generation gangs, but they don't go away in the third. Militarization.
In the third generation, you kind of like do not incorporate the state component here. And for example, it's just much more complex. And the complexity has not been captured by this third generation gang model, because what we're seeing and we're observing in Mexico is kind of like the involvement and the multiplication of the military model to deal with this as a response to the militarization. There's the militarization of the model, then it has a military response, and then the complex adaptive systems, and then the military response. It's a non-ending problem that we have not explained with the third generation gang. It's one and then the other one, and it's kind of like everybody's militarizing itself in a non-ending cycle of violence and confrontation.
I agree, but the militarization is separate than the evolution of the criminal enterprise. It's the state response. And militarization, why is militarization happening? It's happening because of endemic corruption and the state inability to effectively do police reform over years.
John, but the involvement of the military, and this is something important, there is an allegation that the Secretary of Defense of Mexico, General Cienfuegos Cepeda, and also Gerardo Garcia Luna were part of this conspiracy to traffic drugs, or allowing the gangs or the groups that traffic drugs. So this model does not capture the involvement of state forces, and we're talking about state that becomes a criminal state. So this complex adaptive system live off of the state, and this is paramilitarization model. It's not explained by this because they don't act by themselves. It's
Well, I agree, but
nature.
I think you need to read more of what I've written because I have directly addressed that in many of the third generation gang works.
Yeah, but now
it may not be
the crucial
discussed.
part of this. This fits the model, and this is central. And in your model, that is kind of like a a consequence of these transnational and the corruption per se. But this is part of the criminal model, and this is why there are complex adaptive systems.
Yeah, I agree, and I would remind you to look at the work of David Ronfelt and John Arquilla in the 1990s that actually looked at those components. I'd look at the work of Manuel Castells that looks at those components, and I'd say that third generation gang theory is only one of an interlocking set of theories. And if you look at the discussion on criminal insurgencies, I think that fills in the piece. But I think you're absolutely right. Corruption is a driver, impunity is a driver, and I think I'll send you something where I specifically pull that out that you may not have read, and it probably reminds me I need to get it again.
I think it's a fourth generation model now. Why? Because we're talking about a military model that is based on propaganda. It's based on special operations that is kind of like also utilizing the media and elements that have not been incorporated into the third generation gang model, in my view.
I hear you, but I'm saying that it is there, but it's more broadly expressed in the criminal insurgency literature and in a hybrid threat literature. But I take your point, and I think the points you're talking about are very important. I think that they are more. I think they're more present in the model third generation gang than you may have seen. But I think you're right on emphasizing those pieces.
There's something more complex. The complexity has to do with models of, I don't want to use this word, but it's about when you talk about the complex adaptive systems, and you talk about the what's his name when you talk about like how the different insects work, like in a oh my god, I forgot this word. That's
Synergy.
Which
synergy?
No. When we talk about how the bees act, and that has been used to talk about the migrant caravans because of the militarization of the strategies to deal with migration.
I've never used that. I think what you're talking about is more of a full channel network, which I think network theory, when blended with criminal insurgency theory and third generation gang theory, hits it. But I think you're right that demilitarization is a consequence of criminal insurgency more than of gang evolution, but the two complement each other.
Can I ask you a question? Would you both agree that there's some sort of symbiotic relationship between the military and these gangs?
Well, there's a symbiotic relationship between organized crime and the state. There always has been. The question is, how does it express itself?
But I think that the militarization of, operations to deal with drug trafficking, and that started with Los Zetas, because it was not Los Zetas and the response of the state. It was the response of the state because, with Operation, Sealing, Operación Sellamiento, and you sent the judicial, the Policía Judicial Federal to the border, and then Ociel Cárdenas meets Arturo Guzmán de Sena and its guys that were trained in special operations and counterinsurgency operations in the South. They were already responding to a paramilitary police model. So, that is what I am saying, that this is taking us to a new thing that has to do with systems that are not explained by the third generation gang model, in my perspective.
Yeah, and they're not. They're more in the criminal insurgency model than a third generation gang. But militarization, first of all police organizations have a root in military service. Believe me, I was a cop for years. How I think the problem in Mexico is, and other places in Latin America, particularly those that embrace the mano dura approaches, they over militarize. They bring in the military because they're less corrupt or perceived as less corrupt, but they're not necessarily suited for policing. I think the failure there is a failure of police reform, because police
Yeah.
reform has been a perennial problem in Mexico and in other parts of Latin America.
But what happens is that the militarization or paramilitarization of the model, the criminal model plus the responses or the continuation, this creates what is called swarming. And then when we see that, we see that all these groups act in a certain way that reproduces the model as an insect or as these systems that are very, very complex and cannot just be explained by focusing on corruption or focusing on transnational or focusing on the local or I mean, I was talking about all these elements, but
Right.
combining all these elements together, this complexity goes to an extent where whatever you do is not going to stop the homicide rate. And this is exactly what is happening in Mexico. And this is what people are asking me, why the homicide rate continues growing, well, a little bit decline, but that doesn't count. It's a trend that goes up. Why does this happen?
Well, I would argue it's
Because of the
because the
swarming.
state, because swarming is either an operational approach or a tactic. Swarming occurs in many ways, and Ronfeld and Archaea did a lot of work on swarming in addition to their work on networks. I think you're right, but by your definition, you'd be saying that networks are a wicked problem that are insoluble and you can't solve violence. I don't think that's true. I think what we're seeing is the result of state transition, where organized crime is changing the nature of the state, and that's Charles Tilley's work, seen through the lens of my research and others. But this is the equilibrium between organized crime and the state has perhaps broken in places like Mexico and El Salvador and Brazil, but that doesn't mean it's not going to reset, and that doesn't mean it can't reset. But I think you're right. If you use militarization as the only means of resetting it and take out the other social goods that need to be there, you're not going to be able to get there, because there are other components of development that need to be included. I think, for example, to look at, and I'll close it real quick, looking at Brazil as opposed to Mexico, I just yesterday reviewed the movie Tropa de Elite or Elite Squad, looking at a militarized response with the BOPE to the CV in Rio de Janeiro. And I would argue that the UPP, the Unidades de Pacification, were a better model, So I think there's some need to blend criminal justice, policing, and social services and economic development to be able to cope with the changes. And that tells me where the next theory needs to come up.
I'm going to take this moment to chime in here because we have exactly 8 minutes left in our panel. And so I want to check with Ana Castro, our moderator here, to see if we have any questions from our audience on this. And if there aren't any, I've got some for everybody and a couple of themes I'd like everybody to give a quick comment on. Ana, do we have any questions from the audience?
Hello, Nathan. No, we don't have any questions, and you have 15 minutes.
Oh, we have it. Well, okay, we've got a full 15 minutes. Okay, I chimed in a little bit early. Okay, well then, now that I've got
and
the
I have a question as well.
Okay. I just want to raise 3 issues that I see as coming up in these issues. One, what to do about international regulation related to fentanyl. We've had great success in setting up international conventions like the Montreal Protocols on regulating CFCs. Could we do something related to precursors for fentanyl, or is this a much more challenging problem because of dual use and perfectly legitimate uses? Also, state capacity. State capacity seems to be an issue that we keep coming back to. That seems to be a common theme here. And then also, is AMLO right? Is there something wrong in the United States of America in terms of our consumption of drugs? We seem to have an appetite for drugs that seems to be very, very high. And we're not doing very much on demand reduction, despite the fact that RAND studies have told us for decades that it's 7 times more effective than interdiction and militarized strategies. So I want to pose these questions back to the panel. Does anybody want to chime in on either international regulation, state capacity, or demand reduction or harm reduction?
I'd say let Dan go first, and then
Okay.
I got some thoughts on integrating intelligence and harm reduction into operational policing that I think have been missed. But
Fair enough. I'll you know what, I'll take the state one, because I wanted to make the point that I do believe that with all of these, well, at least with the extractivist nature of these gangs that we are seeing an opportunity for the Mexican state to regain legitimacy. This is a problem that can be resolved through proper investigative work. It is a good way to regain the trust of citizens. You're talking about not only polluting their communities, but also an extortion rate that has caused the inflation of food and beverages in Mexico by several percentages. I think the latest estimates were between 20 to 40%. So is this the time to maybe reverse from the over militarization and start really trying to invest in more investigative work because of this extractivist nature?
Well, I would certainly hope so. And one of the key issues is how to pay for better local, state, and federal law enforcement to be able to have the capacities to really invest in investigative approaches. I think that that's got to be one of the key issues. And, John had just mentioned that he was interested in talking about intelligence as it applies to this. So maybe this is a good place for him to chime in on the role of intelligence.
yeah, I mean, this is such, we don't have enough time. We could go for months on this because I think these are complex intersecting problems, and there are multiple facets, and they get in the political discourse simplified down into one thing, like police reform. In Mexico, it's become, do we have the Guardia Nacional, and how do we do that? And there's always discussion of improving the preventive police, but nobody ever talks about the investigative or judicial police in recent memory. So, I mean, we need to look at a holistic police reform in the whole place. I think when you look at intelligence, and intelligence is widely misunderstood, and it's widely misunderstood in the policing community. It's not looked at in a full breadth as the way it's looked at in the national intelligence structures. But I think there are gaps in surveillance. I'll give you an example. One of the things that occurs in the fentanyl crisis in the US is, one, the deaths have gone up immensely, and you see fentanyl mixed with other opioids and other substances. But one of them, you see, for example, they call it xylazine, they call it tronc. It's not a controlled substance, and it gets in there. It's not made for human consumption. It has really deleterious effects on the human body. We just this year started noticing that there was tronc in the fentanyl drug supply, the local drug supply. Yet when you look back, you realize that with deeper surveillance, if we link the surveillance between the criminal enforcement and public health epidemiological surveillance, we might have noticed this trend in drugs sooner. So that's an example. We need to have like holistic intelligence fusion to understand, because intelligence isn't just using secret information, it's processing a whole range of information to understand situation to support a range of decision makers. And I think that's often missed.
We have our first audience question. I think it's a very interesting one. Are countries such as China and India, who supply much of the precursor material for fentanyl, doing so purely for profit, or are there other reasons? Is it done with the full knowledge of their respective governments? Guadalupe, would you like to tackle that one?
Can you repeat again?
Yeah. So are countries such as China and India, who supply much of the precursor material for fentanyl, doing so purely for profit, or are there other reasons for it? Is it done with the full knowledge of their respective governments?
Well, this is a difficult question to answer, because we don't have the evidence to argue that they are doing for geopolitical reasons. There has been a lot of talks about China trying to do the same thing that was, I mean, you know, the opioid, the opioid wars. And I am not sure. I mean, in my perspective, everything has to do with demand and supply, and everything has to do with business. I mean, if we follow the money, if we understand the economic logics of all these, we're gonna know. And geopolitics are explained in the same terms. When you talk about power and control of territories, we have to think about where important resources are based, or where are the important markets, on how you know, who's going to win from involving in wars, and what's the industry that's going to win, and things like that. So, you know, alleging things that go beyond the pure business like model, or the markets, is going too far, because we don't have evidence to prove that, or something like more ideological, something like more mystic. I don't see that happening.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. What I would say is the Chinese government going to be eager to jump onto an international framework to deal with fentanyl if the United States is engaging in sanctions against their microchip industry or various other issues? That there are other issues at play that will limit whether or not they want to cooperate on international frameworks. But again, that's separate and distinct from there's some intentionality behind versus the more likely explanation, which I think is what you're saying is the more likely explanation, is this is just run-of-the-mill corruption that's getting by.
Yeah. Well, Nate, one of the issues on this, and it's in hybrid warfare discussions, there's discussions of nation states using strategic crime as means, and that's not unheard of. And the Chinese have played in those arenas. Are they using fentanyl as a direct wedge to pay us back for the opium wars? That would be very hard to prove. But you have to remember, we look at it as China's as one giant unitary state with all actors. We forget that there are principal agent phenomena occurring in here. And I mentioned like Fujian organized crime. Well, you know what? China's got multiple organized crime organizations. Many of them predate the People's Republic of China. There are fissures within the People's Republic of China. For years, the PLA was run like a bunch of warlords conducting a whole bunch of private business for their own, beneficial, own benefit. Xi has purged lots of people for corruption, allegedly. Some of it's probably, you could argue is related to political power, but demonstrating that's hard. But getting an international agreement on fentanyl, yeah, we could perhaps do that. But we have international agreements on other drug crimes. We haven't canceled out the drug trade in the last 100 years. So, I mean, I think those are tools. You look at them of ways to do it. But what makes this hard is it's not a single thing. When you talk about, you just look at the work that you and I have done on the CJNJ and the Sinaloa networks. They're not unitary enterprises. They're all complex amalgamations of multiple different types of actors that come together. So when you add states are just another part of that equation. But there is discussion specifically. There was a book that was written by a couple of Chinese colonels about 25 years ago, it seems now, 25 years ago, called Unrestricted Warfare, where the Chinese were thinking conceptually that part of their doctrine might include things like strategic crime. Does that mean they're doing it? It means that's something best discussed by intelligence organizations like the Five Eyes, and not in a public forum. But I mean, I think there's certainly things to think about.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left, so I think this is our time to start thinking about concluding thoughts here. And so the primary concluding thought is, where do we go from here? And that's the question I want to pose. What can we do about third generation gangs, about this fentanyl issue, about this networked phenomenon of organized crime going forward? So I'd like to start with Guadalupe. Why don't you go ahead?
Well, I mean, yeah, how can we think about this, which is very, very important. I believe that the narratives matter, And I think that we are now focusing our conversation on fentanyl, drugs, geopolitics, the role of China and India, and we are driven by the narrative, electoral narrative in the United States, and we need to separate the analysis in order to formulate a better question, right? What the fentanyl crisis is about, and what is driving the fentanyl crisis? Who is producing the synthetic drugs, and where are the synthetic drugs really coming from? Are they all coming from Mexico, produced in Mexico, from precursors in China? Or is that half of the story or a third of the story? Because when there is demand, there's going to be supply only. And we need to understand also what caused this fentanyl crisis in the first place, and what is the role of the pharmaceutical companies, and what the pharmaceutical companies have caused in this crisis too, and how harm reduction, we didn't deal with the harm reduction strategies that are touted as the main thing to deal with the fentanyl crisis, or the more humane, or addressing the, these focusing on human rights. I am not sure that this is true, but we don't have time to address this complex issue. But I think we have to go part by part, and we have to formulate questions that in a very different way, right? Not connecting the guns and the fentanyl, because there are more players, and there is something that can be explained in the United States and not needs to go to China or Mexico.
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to pivot that same question. Where do we go from here to John? We've got about 1 or 2 minutes, and leave some time for Dan here.
Yeah, no, what I'd say is we do need to separate the different parts of the equation. I think the flows I showed, which come from congressional testimony I gave with Dr. Bunker a couple of months ago, derived on DEA data, show that it's not primarily just the China to Mexico to US route, that there are other routes they need to be accounted for. Our local demand is certainly part of it. That's why I think we need to add harm reduction to the efforts. And absolutely, there are global geopolitical pieces. There always are, because it's, when it comes down to whether you're talking about organized crime of which variety, mafias, gangs, cartels, triads, there's a component of power related to that. Is it over an electoral power? No, but it is power, and it certainly plays in the territorial gangs in Brazil. And I think we do need to look at Mexico differently than we do Brazil, differently than we do Central America, the Northern Triangle of Central America. Even within the nations there are different permutations. Within the United States, there are different permutations, but these are at core transnational global illicit flows that work in a global illicit political economy. What Niels Gilman once called deviant globalization. That's part of the state change that comes. So you have to break the components apart to look at individual solutions for different pieces, but you have to pull them back together to look at the macro level as well. And that's very hard, and that requires national level effort with input from not only intelligence professionals, but police professionals, development specialists, and on and on. So very complicated problems. I think it's clear, however, that the narratives, and you're right, narratives are key to how we understand the phenomena. Disinformation is key to how we understand it, and there's lots of disinformation being used to further all different types of agendas. And that's going to be hard because we don't have a unitary single voice. That's why discussions like this are vitally important.
Yeah. And I think this is a great way to pivot to Dan here, because Dan has done some amazing work on information warfare conducted by the CJNG. So where do we go from here, Dan?
I think it's really going to come down to this fight over citizens. I think the more that we see these linkages disseminate, the more that we understand that these are civilians that are being involved, whether it's in illicit fishing or is illicit logging, or just having to pay for having a business that makes money in Mexico. We need to understand that these linkages that they're having with organized crime are starting to outnumber the linkages that we have with a state that can be there for them and give them the adequate supplies and resources that they need. So unless the state understand that it's in a fight for its life against these cartels to regain these community links and start to really work with communities in Mexico to regain trust, we will not be able to succeed.
Yeah, that is a fantastic point. During my field work in Mexico, that was one of the key things that I found, was that it wasn't just that organized crime was coming in and extorting. In some cases, they were providing protection, but not from their violence or street violence, but protection from law enforcement itself. Protection from the bribes that would be charged by law enforcement itself, the extraction of the state apparatus itself. And that was one of the key grievances, if we look at it in a criminal insurgent perspective, that organized crime was stepping in and remedying it. And that was a dangerous thought. So we are out of time here, and I think we've covered this topic very well. We've hit on demand reduction, state capacity, international regulation of precursors, third generation gang, complex adaptive systems. We've covered myriad issues, but our time is coming to a close, and so we've got to wrap up and bid everyone adieu. So goodbye, everyone.